The internal body is separated into internal cavities, which are closed off to their environment. The purpose of these cavities is that they provide protection to organs that are within them. So you need to know the names of the cavities, the subcavities, and the different organs that are found within them. So we'll be going over those next. Also, be able to relate the cavities using directional terms. So, for example, we would say that the dorsal cavity is blank to the ventral cavity. And this could be an example of an exam question or a quiz question. So you'd have to be able to fill in the blank. And since the dorsal cavity is behind the ventral cavity, we would say posterior. If I, however, wrote it the opposite way, if I said the ventral cavity is blank to the dorsal cavity, you would use the opposing directional term that you learned about in the last video. So the ventral cavity is in front of the dorsal cavity. So we would say anterior. So this diagram shows those various cavities. So we're going to start with the largest cavities first. We have the dorsal cavity, which is the most posterior cavity. Then we have the ventral cavity, which is more anterior, and it has subcavities within it. So the dorsal cavity is subdivided into the cranial cavity and the vertebral cavity. The cranial cavity contains the brain. The vertebral cavity contains the spinal cord. Now you can see that the cranial cavity is superior to the vertebral cavity. It may seem kind of odd to say that this is part of the dorsal cavity because it goes to the forehead. And the reason for that is when we begin development as an embryo, the tissue for the spinal cord extends out of the brain, the nervous tissue in the brain. The abdominal pelvic cavity then can be subdivided into the thoracic cavity and the abdominal cavity or abdominal pelvic cavity. The abdominal pelvic cavity can then be subdivided into the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity, which is inferior to it. So we saw the subcavities for the dorsal cavity, cranial cavity, and vertebral cavity. And then you need to know what's found within it. Now for the thoracic cavity, it contains the heart and the lungs. The heart is within the pericardial cavity, which is also within what's called the mediastinum. So this would be the inferior mediastinum, and this would be the superior mediastinum. When we look at that word mediastinum, media means middle. So it's in the middle between both pleural cavities, between both sides of the lung. The abdominal cavity contains the digestive viscera. Viscera means organs. So if you think about somebody having a visceral response to something, that means they might vomit, for example. The pelvic cavity contains the urinary bladder, the reproductive organs, and the rectum. The rectum is the very end of the large intestine, but the bulk of the large intestine is in the abdominal cavity. Also, separating the abdominal cavity or abdominal pelvic cavity from the thoracic cavity is a skeletal muscle called the diaphragm. So again, the ventral cavity is going to contain the thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavities, but we can further subdivide those. To look at it a little differently, we can use this image, which is an additional one that's not in your book. So the thoracic cavity, we can subdivide it into the two pleural cavities. and each cavity surrounds one lung. Between the pleural cavities is the mediastinum. There's a superior mediastinum and an inferior mediastinum. The inferior mediastinum is going to have the pericardial cavity, which encloses the heart. The superior mediastinum has things above that, like thoracic organs such as the esophagus and trachea. So again, mediastinum means that it's in the middle here. I like this image because it was color-coded. And then, of course, the pleural cavity contains both lungs, the right lungs and the left lungs. And remember, when you're looking at an image or you're looking at your patient, your right is their left and your left is their right because they're facing you. For the abdominal pelvic cavity, remember we can subdivide that into the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity, which we see here. They're represented by different colors in this case. So the abdominal cavity contains things like the stomach, the small, large intestines, spleen, and the liver. It does not contain the kidneys because they're actually what are called retroperitoneal. They're behind or posterior to the abdominal cavity. The pelvic cavity contains urinary bladder, reproductive organs, rectum. And remember, the diaphragm is, again, this skeletal muscle that separates the thoracic cavity. Put this in a different color so you can see it. The thoracic cavity from the abdominal pelvic cavity. For the dorsal cavity, which is a little bit easier, remember it's subdivided into the cranial cavity, which has the brain, and the vertebral cavity, which has the spine. And the ventral, which is a little more complicated, is subdivided into thoracic and abdominopelvic cavities. You'll probably be going over this in lab as well, so you'll have a chance to ask your lab instructor also. If you're online for lab, don't be afraid to email your lab instructor. This slide is showing a homeostatic imbalance. And it's an excellent one because it demonstrates the importance of the diaphragm. Remember, the diaphragm is a skeletal muscle that separates two cavities. And in this case, this skeletal muscle separates the thoracic and the abdominopelvic cavities. Now, when somebody has a hiatal hernia, there's a part of the stomach that is where it should not be. And that part of the stomach is protruding through the diaphragm into the thoracic cavity. It can be very, very problematic issue. So this is what's called the lower esophageal sphincter. You don't need to know that until next semester. But what happens is a sphincter is basically a valve that contracts. And in this case, part of the stomach now is where it's not supposed to be. The stomach is never supposed to be superior to the diaphragm. But in a hiatal hernia, part of the stomach is. So this is actually part of the stomach that should not be there. So this can be very problematic. It could cause something as simple as heartburn, but it could cause much more important problems, bigger problems like impacting the lungs and making it more difficult to breathe.